This was the pinnacle of women's rights, beginning the suffrage movement and leading many men and women to a new tomorrow. This was the Seneca Falls Convention. This was one of the first well-known conventions that was known for really catering to women, their rights, and what they felt they deserved. Women had felt like they were struggling to really have their voice heard, like they were being constrained. Women could only be heard through protests, and some were punished because of their participation. Women held no political power in the United States, and because of all this separation, many women closely identified themselves with slaves. This is why many radical abolitionists identified closely with the women's rights cause, and vice versa. This estrangement between women and men slowly led to the forming of this convention and others that later followed. The Seneca Falls Convention was a two-day event in 1848 that lasted from July 19th to July 20th. The main topic was women's rights, namely for women to earn the right to vote. While that wasn't the outcome, the convention did end with a Declaration of Sentiments, a list of grievances and rights that they felt women rightly deserved. There were many people that attended, but the true minds behind this convention were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a New York-born woman and was a middle child. She was born on November 12, 1815, in Johnston. Stanton was not like most young girls were at the time. She enjoyed classes that were usually deemed for men and was a participant in sports, something that was also usually very masculine. Stanton was even encouraged by her father, who was a lawyer, to study law with him. She later used that knowledge to her advantage, as she had some very well-constructed arguments for women's rights, much to her father's dismay. Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived her life as a very renowned feminist, abolitionist, and supporter of temperance. Along with all the action for women's rights and abolition, she also formed the Women's State Temperance Society. She died on October 26, 1902, in New York City, and while she is gone, she is not forgotten for all of her amazing feminist accomplishments. Another creator of the event was Lucretia Mott, born on January 3, 1793 in Massachusetts. She lived her life as an abolitionist, reformer, and feminist. She was one of the most prominent women of the abolition movement and still had time to be very involved with issues of women's rights. She was the key speaker at the Seneca Falls Convention and led many of the discussions. Since she was such a devoted Quaker, a cause that was heavily involved in abolition, she herself was a very heavy-handed advocate for that cause. Mott founded a Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society and became the secretary of it. She was also elected president of the Women's Rights Convention in Syracuse, New York. Lucretia passed on November 11, 1880, and is still remembered as an amazing woman for abolition and the women's rights cause. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott met at an international anti-slavery convention that was held in London. They were both supporters of the newly budding women's rights movement in the U.S. They were completely infuriated by the fact that the male leaders at this event were utterly refusing to allow the female delegates to be seated at the conference. These two became close allies and friends because of this, and they sided on many issues. They would commonly exchange letters after this convention, where they would often speak about organizing a cause or organization between the two of them. This idea was finally expressed in the summer of 1848 when they formally began the true women's rights movement. These two reputable figures, as well as many others, attended this event and came up with an overall positive outcome, the Declaration of Sentiments. This was a list of grievances set up for women. These ended up being a crucial part of the women's rights movement. There were many important issues stated in this document, such as: he has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. He has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. Having deprived her of this first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. He has taken from her all right and property, even to the wages she earns. He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming, to all intents and purposes, her master, the law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and to administer chastisement. He has so framed the laws of divorce as to what shall be the proper causes of divorce in case of separation, to whom the guardianship of the children shall be given, as to be wholly regardless of the happiness of the women, in law, in all cases, going upon the false supposition of the supremacy of man, and giving all power into his hands. After depriving her of all rights as a married woman, if single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable to it. He has monopolized nearly all profitable employments, and from those she is permitted to follow, she receives but a scanty remuneration. He closes against her all the avenues to wealth and distinction, which he considers most honorable to himself. As a teacher of theology, medicine, or law, she is not known. He has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her. He allows her in church as well as state, but a subordinate position, claiming apostolic authority for her exclusion from the ministry, with some exceptions from any public participation in the affairs of the church. He has created a false public sentiment by giving to the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies which exclude women from society are not only tolerated but deemed of little account in man. He has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself, claiming it as his right to assign for her sphere of action, which belongs to her conscience and her God. He has endeavored, in every way that he could, to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. A few of the immediate effects of this convention was a larger understanding of women. This was the genuine beginning of the women's suffrage movement. Many viewed it as a blueprint for women's rights. Most of the effects of this convention weren't seen until very long after, as the general impact in the beginning was simply to just have people talk about women and the possible extents of the women's rights movement. There was a huge impact from the end of the convention to present day. One of these impacts, about 20 years after, was when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony created the National Women's Suffrage Association with the goal to gain voting rights and an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Later that same year, Henry Blackwell and Lucy Stone formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, focusing on women achieving voting rights from the individual state constitutions being amended. These two causes eventually fused together to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, otherwise known as the NAWSA. They campaigned for voting rights per state, not for the entire country. Leading up to 1918, 16 different states adopted an amendment for women to gain the right to vote. A major milestone that was reached by this convention was the fact that women would finally earn the right to vote. On August 18, 1920, suffragists finally achieved a goal that they had been working towards for over 70 years. While no woman who had signed the Declaration of Sentiments were able to participate in this victory, it was still an amazing feat for women. This convention is still referenced today when looking for equality between both sexes because it was such a huge milestone and truly kicked off the fight for equality. Following this were more and more battles, as seen by the copious court cases and acts throughout the 20th century. A few examples of this are: in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was put in place, putting a minimum wage into effect that wasn't based on the sex of the recipient. Following that, in 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed by Congress, granting equal wages for the same position regardless of sex, race, or religion. Another case, Weeks v. Southern Bell, a case that changed restrictions on women's work and gave women more of an opportunity to take jobs that were previously known to be only for men. Then we see the infamous case of Roe v. Wade, where it was decided that the Constitution protects a woman's right to privacy. This right to privacy extended. It included namely her own medical decisions, such as abortion. This case is still heavily debated, but for the time being, it protects women and gives them a safe procedure. Along with these cases and acts put into place, there were several political milestones exclusively involving women, and when they ran or were elected into political office. These people include Jeannette Rankin, the first woman in Congress. While Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the first woman to run for the House of Representatives, she did not receive a spot in Congress. Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president, known leader of the suffrage movement. Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. Nancy Pelosi, the first female Speaker of the House. And Hillary Clinton, she became the first woman to be the presumptive nominee for a major party for president. This was in 2016. These women would not be able to get into the political area that they did without the Seneca Falls Convention. These acts and cases also wouldn't have had the positive changes without this impactful event to start it off. This event even ties to modern-day feminism. Many current feminists and feminist philosophers cite this event, that being the Seneca Falls Convention, when talking about their views and works of feminism. This convention spurred first, second, and third wave feminism. These all focused on different women's issues. The first wave primarily focused on women's suffrage and some employment and education rights, which led right into second wave feminism. The second wave of feminism revolved around the issues of both employment and reproductive rights, as seen in Roe v. Wade. The third and most recent wave is involved with a lot of different mainstream and somewhat unimportant issues. While this wave is not always liked, it does have many positive influences, such as helping women in other countries and fighting to maintain the current rights. Feminism was so greatly impacted by the Seneca Falls Convention, and while this may have caused some views that were extreme and not necessarily liked, it was still an amazing convention for lifting men and women up and changing America's views on women's rights. The Seneca Falls Convention was an amazing event that led the U.S. one step closer to equality. Both men and women are extremely grateful for such a strong start and such a caring cause. Women now have their voices heard and aren't afraid of judgment for their beliefs. This truly did take femininity and masculinity to places it had never and would never think it could go.